I grew up Mormon. I hit all of the church's benchmarks. I was in it. I was in for life. So I thought. At age 31, everything came crumbling down. This is the story of why I left the Mormon church and nearly lost everything that I love. I've really debated doing this video because I'm not interested in arguing about history or troublesome doctrine. This experience of leaving the Mormon church is the most challenging, the most difficult and painful experience I've ever had in my life. And maybe, just maybe, if there were more stories shared honestly about this experience, maybe it would have relieved some of that pain. Maybe I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes that I made. I don't know that to be true, but that's the reason I'm doing this video, is that somebody watching this is in the same position today that I was 10 years ago. And I want them to understand that it is challenging. It's very painful, but you can do it well. There's also somebody watching this who has nothing to do with Mormonism, who's interested in the story, or maybe knows somebody who is Mormon or a member of a high demand group and they're trying to leave. And hopefully my story can help you help them, because they need community, they need people, they need you. I grew up in a small town in Utah. It wasn't a typical Mormon upbringing. My mom was active and a member of the church. She took me to church and raised me in the church. My dad did not go to church. He was inactive. He was a smoker for most of my life. There's a law in the church, a doctrine called the word of wisdom, that prohibits members in good standing from partaking in alcohol, tobacco, coffee, or tea. And when you do those things openly, you're not really welcome in the community. There's a level of judgment and a level of outsiderness that's just really uncomfortable. And I'm sure my dad felt that and didn't have any interest in going to church. I also felt that outedness because another idea within the church is that you need a faithful priesthood holder in the home. This, of course, is the man. And so that the male can have the power to talk to God and receive revelation for your family and guide your family well. Well, I didn't have that. And I felt that judgment. I felt that absence. I felt that awkwardness all growing up of knowing that I didn't have this key thing in the home. So that really colored my journey a lot. I got baptized when I was 8 years old. I actually got baptized by a BYU football player. I thought that was pretty cool. His name was Sim Tia. I was confirmed a member of the church at 8 years old as well. Those are two saving ordinances that the church has lined out for you, is baptism. And if you've grown up in the church, that typically happens at 8 years old. You're choosing at 8 years old to be a member of the church, to dedicate your life to Jesus Christ and the church. And then they also confirm you a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they give you the gift of the Holy Ghost. I got the priesthood at 12 years old. This is the lower priesthood called the Aaronic priesthood. I progressed in each level of the priesthood at the age that I was supposed to. And then at 19, I went on an LDS mission. Went to Minnesota and Wisconsin, where I paid $12,000 to preach the gospel, knock doors, serve the church for 2 years. At some point, I might do a video about my experience as a missionary. Now looking back, this is one of the moments in my life that I'm most ashamed of. The things that I said and did to people in the mission field to try to get new members of our church, it still haunts me today. Served that mission and served it faithfully. I then came home and married Katie, my wife. We've now been married for 20 years this year. But when I got home, we dated for 2 weeks, got engaged after 2 weeks, and then we were married 6 weeks later. So within 2 months, I'd come home from the mission and I married Katie in the Manti, Utah temple. Now, this is another significant part of my story, because in getting married in the temple and my dad not being a part of the church, I made a decision to get married in a building, in a place that my dad was not allowed to go into. because he was not active in the church, because he was not obeying the word of wisdom, he couldn't go and watch me get married. This is another deep, devastating point of contention in my journey in Mormonism and ultimately out of Mormonism. Katie and I get married. Within 2 years, we have our first daughter, Addison. It's incredible, being incredible and challenging, and the church is 100% guiding our parenthood. It's guiding our relationship. It is the central point between the two of us, between our families. It is the connection point to all of our friends. We are immersed deeply into the Mormon church and community and way of life. And this time, I'm also progressing in the levels of the church as far as callings go, and ultimately mostly serving with the youth, with kids from ages 12 to 18, doing things like teaching them lessons on Sunday, taking them on extra activities during the week. I was deeply involved and loved being involved with the youth of our church. I just related to them well. It was fun, and it was really important to me to share the gospel with them. Now fast forward to having our second daughter, Kenya. I had had a couple of failed businesses here in Utah, and I had an idea for a new business, and I thought the best place to start this business was in Southern California because there was much more of a market for it. So we packed up everything we owned into our Scion XB, and we hit the road, and we moved down to Southern California to start this business. Now you have to understand, it sounds so naive to talk about it this way now, but I had not, other than my mission for 2 years in Minnesota, I hadn't had much experience with people that weren't Mormon and didn't live outside of Utah. Now, there's a thing in Mormon culture where we call anything outside of Utah the mission field, right? Because in the Mormon church, there's a saying that says, every member a missionary. What that means is, even if you're not a dedicated missionary on your 2-year mission, it means you as a member are expected to be sharing the gospel with people and inviting them to baptism. So I was so excited to move to Southern California, to be in the mission field, because I was going to be able to share the gospel with so many people who needed it so badly. You know, there's this idea in the Mormon church that there's good people in the world everywhere, obviously, but they don't have the fullness of joy, happiness, or truth unless they're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now think about that for just a second. Think about what an interesting belief that is. Meaning there's only a few million members of the church. And so only a few million members, only a few million people on this earth actually experience the fullness of happiness, joy, and truth. And I actually believed that. So I was so excited. We're going to move to Southern California. I'm going to teach so many people. I'm going to help them experience the fullness of joy, happiness, and truth. And it's going to be incredible. Little did I know that that principle was ultimately going to be the demise of my faith. So we moved to Southern California, and I start working with some really amazing people. The industry that I was in particular really lent itself to husband-wife business owners. It just kind of was the nature of it. And so I got a window into how a lot of these great folks lived and how they related to each other, what their marriages were like, what their relationships were like, what their faith was like, what their joy and happiness was like. It was really it was so interesting for me to be able to experience something so different than what I knew, but so beautiful and wonderful. And I started to ask myself a question that cracked the door open to disbelief. I didn't know it at the time. I asked myself the question, what if I don't have anything to offer? What if they don't need anything from me to live happy and joyful and have truth? I know it doesn't seem like a big deal, but to me, that question was earth-shaking. I didn't know what to do with it, and I wrestled with it for a while, very silently. I didn't let anybody know. There's one thing you have to know about high-demand organizations, Mormonism, there's a ton of them, is that the consequences for leaving, for disaffecting, are really grave. The entire doctrine of the Mormon Church is built on the idea that families can be together forever after this life. So this life is an opportunity for you to prove your faithfulness. And as you prove your faithfulness, you become worthy of being sealed together forever with your family. So if you go through all of the ordinances and if you do all of the actions and you get sealed together as a family, and then one person leaves, one person breaks that sealing, it means that they won't be with you for all eternity. And it's actually messing up all of the plan of heaven and getting to the highest level of heaven. So with that context, leaving is a huge, huge deal. So I was determined that I wasn't going to leave. No matter what came up for me, it wasn't coming to that point yet. Then, as I mentioned, I was working with the youth. And one of the things that we did with the youth is called baptisms for the dead. It is as strange as it sounds. Basically, genealogy is important to the Mormon Church because they do research on names of people who never joined the Mormon Church. And they do this research and they gather these names and then they take those names to the temple. And in the temple, somebody who is living, like myself or a 14-year-old kid, could be baptized, physically baptized in water, while they say the name of the dead person. So it's a proxy. It's like this person is getting baptized for this dead person that never got the chance or chose not to get baptized in the Mormon Church. It was early Saturday morning. I had taken a group of youth, ages 14 to 18, to the temple to do baptisms for the dead together. And I remember specifically sitting in that temple while the baptisms are happening, and I'm flanked by probably 10 or 12 kids that I had grown really close to. And they looked up to me, and I had taught them, and we'd done activities together. And it hit me so hard, the thought that this thing that we're doing in the temple is strange. And I can see on their faces that it feels a little awkward and weird, and they're not sure about it. But it felt like, and I could be totally making this up, but it felt like they were looking at me to see that it was okay. Because I had done the same thing as a youth and then also as an adult going into the temple, doing some very odd things. I had looked to other people in my life that I trusted to say, well, if they're doing it, then I'm okay with it. I can go through with it. It must be okay if because I know them outside of this context and they're really great people. So if they're doing it, I'm good to go. And I could sense that these kids were doing the same thing. And then it hit me, oh my gosh, my kids could potentially do the same thing. If that's the case, I better be 100% sure that this is true. Now there's an idea. When we talk about high demand groups or cults and somebody getting out of one of them, typically there's one question that will allow somebody to break the mind control, to break the brainwash that has happened where they've accepted a lot of things wholesale that maybe felt uncomfortable, it didn't seem quite right, but they were willing to accept them because of whatever reason. There's one question that seems to break that spell the best. And this question hit me that day in the temple. And it was, what if it's not true? I had never asked myself that question. What if it's not true? Not a statement, it's not true. Not a statement, it is true. That's the statement I'd been using my whole life, is I know this to be true. I know it's true. We get up in front of each other every single month and say it over and over again. I know this church to be true. This was the first time in my life that I had asked myself, what if it's not true? And it opened the door even wider to where I could start seeing things that weren't right. I could start seeing and realizing that a lot of people didn't need anything from me, that maybe I didn't have the fullness of joy and happiness and truth. Maybe, just maybe, I was just another human trying to figure out this life just like anybody else, that I didn't have a monopoly on the truth or on ordinances or on a place in heaven. It was both extremely freeing, like immense amounts of freedom, and crippling fear. Because, like I mentioned, the gospel being this, the doctrine being built on the idea of families and families going to heaven together, I knew that if I let anybody know that I was doubting, it would be devastating. I could lose everything. I could lose my marriage to my wife that I loved so much. I could lose my kids. I could be shunned by my family. I could be shunned by my community. I knew the consequences because I had witnessed other people experience the consequences of leaving, of not being faithful. I had watched my dad be essentially ostracized from our community, our neighborhood, because of his standing in the church. So I was determined that I wouldn't let anybody know what was going on. For 2 years, I stayed silent. Within those 2 years, I mentioned it to Katie a couple times. But the context in which I would mention it was always just, hey, I'm going through some things. I have some doubts. But you know what? Just like Thomas, he had some doubts, but man, it strengthened his faith. And I know I'm going to come out on the other side of this so strong. But deep down inside, I knew that was a lie. And I know Katie noticed. I was starting to distance myself from the church. Even though I was going every week, I was towing the line, I was running the look, I started not accepting callings. When the church leaders tried to give me assignments of the church, I said no, because I was too busy or working things out or whatever. In the meantime, we had moved back to Utah and we had our third child, Milo.
Okay, now I'm ready.
Hi, today we are doing a full cheerleading class.
And our first child, Addison, was turning 8. And if you remember, 8 is when most people in the church get baptized. And tradition is if you are faithful, if you're in a faithful family in the church, your dad, because it has to be a man who holds the priesthood, will baptize you. And my dad didn't baptize me, obviously, because he wasn't in the church. I didn't have that experience. And now it was time for Addison to get baptized. But the problem was I was completely, at this point, disbelieving. I was in complete internal contention with the church. A lot of the things that it was teaching about women, about homosexuality, I thought it was really damaging, actually. And so I was in this internal conflict, and I needed to baptize Addison because I was towing the line and nobody knew my disbelief. And so I baptized her as a completely unbelieving member of the church. And what's so funny is when you baptize them and then you confirm somebody, you say a little prayer in the confirmation. And in the confirmation, all I said was how much I loved her and all of my hopes for her and her happiness. I never said anything about the church or the gospel. And I had so many people come up to me afterwards and say that they knew that my words were guided by God and by the Spirit. And they had no idea that I just wasn't even a believing member. And all I was doing was speaking to her as a dad to encourage her and to show her my love. A little after that, I found out that somebody really close to us, a member of our family, was going through something very, very similar. I'm not going to tell you how I found out because that's not all my story to tell. But I found out that he was also secretly disaffecting from the Mormon church. I immediately reached out to him, and in that conversation, I asked him, are you struggling? Are you not believing in the church? And he said, oh, I'm out. I'm 100% out, and at this point, I don't care who knows. And then he proceeded to tell me, he was much more logical in his leaving than mine. Mine was much more emotional and spiritual. Then he proceeded to tell me all about the deep, deep, troublesome history and doctrines of the church that I didn't even know about. Things in the history about the prophet Joseph and founder Joseph Smith and Brigham Young that are not taught or talked about anywhere in the church as you grow up. I mean, at this point, I'm 30 years old, and these are things that I'm just now finding out about. Because the church tells you not to read anything about the church that isn't produced by the church. Well, that should be your first warning sign for any group or organization. Is like, if they tell you not to read about it unless they've published it, unless they've created it, that's a big problem. But I didn't realize that. I had no idea. He gave me books to read and podcasts to listen to. And I'll tell you what, I went down a 3-month rabbit hole where I learned all of these things. I read voraciously. I listened to thousands of hours, it feels like, of stories and podcasts and facts and all of these things that I'd never heard of before, and it just crumbled. And I was out. There was no question. I was out. And I told Katie that I was out. I was done. And that initiated the most challenging and painful time of our marriage. For almost 18 months, I was certain we were done. Every Sunday was wrought with arguments of if we were going to go to church or not, if we were going to raise our kids in this. And all this time I'm trying not to tell her about the things that I know about and that I'm learning about because she just can't hear it. If you know this, anybody who's in a high demand organization and still believing, it's really challenging for them to hear anything contradictory to that. And sometimes when you tell somebody something contradictory, it drives them further away. And I didn't want that to happen, but we could not reconcile this difference. I even wrote letters that I ended up never giving her, luckily. But I even said in those letters, if you believe this, you need to leave me and go find somebody who's in it so that they can support your belief. Because remember, I was the priesthood holder of our home. So if I'm out, if I leave, that means they lose their chance at the highest level of heaven because they don't have a priesthood holder in the home. And I knew that my kids were now going to grow up with the shame that I grew up with of a dad not being in the church and not having a priesthood holder in the home. I'm telling you, every day was wrought with the fear, the deep, deep fear that she would leave me. And ultimately, I couldn't blame her. This stage, I call my angry stage. I wanted to burn the church down. I made some pretty big mistakes being very public about my disaffection on Facebook, on social media. I came off angry. There is an archetype in Mormon culture where they talk about people who leave the church, that if you leave the church, you can't leave the church alone. And I totally played into that archetype. I was angry. I was trying to convince people that it was wrong. I was talking about things that were really troublesome about the church. And there were a lot of current things happening that were very troublesome about the church, especially around homosexuality or children of people who were gay not being able to be married or baptized until they were 18. And it was a really messy time. There were a lot of messy times for the church. at this moment, and I was at the forefront of it, and I thought I was going to convince people, and I ruined some relationships for sure, and I offended some people that didn't need to be offended. I was so mad. Eventually, Katie went on her own journey of looking into some things, wanting to find out what it was that me and a few of our family members were not happy with, not willing to tolerate. She went on that journey, and that was a long, devastating journey for her too. I wouldn't wish it upon anybody, and at the same time, I was so happy and excited that she was at least looking into it. That was like a glimmer of hope that she could at least understand where I was coming from, and that even if she decided to stay, we could work something out because she would see the legitimacy of my position. That journey for her ultimately and fairly quickly led her out of the church. And in this moment, even though it was so hard and so painful, I found more freedom in life, more freedom in thinking, more connectedness to me and myself and what I believed. I found more opportunity to investigate my beliefs and the things that had driven, the things that weren't working. And the best part is that Katie and I started doing it together. We started having the opportunity to explore what we actually believed, what we actually thought our principles in life were, what was moral, what was immoral. And we got to do it, we got to do that exploring together and experience heartache and triumph and excitement and sadness without the judgment, without the mediator of the church. The church was always our connection point. So everything we did in our relationship, whether it was sex or hobbies or roles in the family, all was influenced by the church. And now we had total freedom to decide all of that for ourselves. And we became so much closer than we ever were. I mean, I loved her and we had a good marriage before, but this skyrocketed our relationship and our connection. I'm so grateful for what we went through so that we could have what we have today, having done that exploration together and still decided that we wanted each other and that we wanted to show up for each other in a meaningful way. I call this the acceptance stage. I had accepted what had happened. I had accepted that I had been fooled. I had accepted that I had done some really terrible, shitty things in the name of the gospel, Jesus Christ, the church, whatever. I was starting to accept it, and the anger was starting to recede. And it was starting to be, the anger was being replaced by curiosity and love and gratitude for the journey that we had taken together. But here's what I still can't reconcile. And I don't know if I ever will be able to, and I think that's okay. There's a paradox that I live in, which is I don't want anything to do with the Mormon church. And there were some really intense, painful experiences because of it. And it gave me so many beautiful things. Like my mission taught me to work hard, taught me to communicate well with people. I don't know that Katie and I ever would have met, and I also don't think she ever would have considered me as a husband if I wasn't a member of the church. So it brought us together. Then we had our 3 beautiful children that we love so much. And I can't reconcile the pain, suffering, misery, terrible things that the church has done and did do, and my experience in it, with everything beautiful that came from it. So the stage I'm in now, I call it peace. It's a stage of contentment. It is what it is. I can't make sense of it. and I stopped trying. I'm not even sure what making sense of it would do. As soon as I decided to stop trying to reconcile it or get revenge, any of that sort of stuff, I had an overwhelming sense of peace for life, for my relationships as a father, and a peace for the future, that we're gonna be okay. And as for my beliefs now, I don't know. And I'm at peace with that. I don't know if there's a God, and I don't know if it makes a difference, to be quite honest. I love human beings, and I love relieving suffering and being a part of the joy of other people's lives. And if there is a God, seems like that would be the central. If it's a loving God who cares about the people that are here, I think that would be the central tenet of the requirements or whatever, is to be a good person and to relieve the suffering of others and be a part of the joy of others and contribute to the joy of others. And so I don't know that knowing whether there's a God or not, knowing if there's a Savior or if Jesus Christ is a true Savior or whatever, I don't know that it makes a difference. And I'm at peace with that. One of the things that I hear so many ex-Mormons talk about, ex-Mormons and ex-members of any cult or high-demand group, is I always hear them say, "Oh, I'm so much happier now. I'm so much happier now that I've left." And anybody listening to this, anybody watching this, I want you to know my experience is I don't think I'm happier. I don't think that's even a part of the equation. I left because it was inconsistent. It isn't true from my perspective. And in fact, following it and being a part of it, I think, did more damage than good. And that's why I've decided not to be a part of it and not raise my family in it. But even when you leave, it's just like being in. There's ups and downs. There's moments of elation and excitement and happiness and joy. And there's moments of deep sorrow and sadness and depression. Life is life. Whether you're in it or you're out of it is not going to determine your happiness or your joy. At least it hasn't determined my happiness or my joy. But I am more at peace with myself that I'm out than I was when I was in.